I bow to God, I bow to all of you. I give my love from the core of my heart to all of you. It is a beautiful opportunity to be here for these few days. The topic, new sciences meeting old wisdom. If we look, the scientists are much older in age and meeting some younger person, and it sounds like a paradox. There are two people and they believed in two different faiths. So one believed that God is in the West. So he started his journey westward to meet God. And the other one, he believed God is in East, and he moved eastward. And we know this earth is round. One day what happened? Both of them met each other. What? You started moving westward, I started moving eastward. How could we meet facing each other? Now when they meet each other, it is a question whether they greet or they become a little bit showing the face this side and going. The topic, new sciences, meeting old wisdom. If the topic I understood correctly, let the science meet. We are the old people with old wisdom to greet you, to hug you with love. Science has done tremendously good for humankind by removing blind belief, helping us to fight with human sufferings in the form of medicine, giving healthcare, agricultural revolution, production has increased for growing population. Science has helped us to understand a lot at the same time. Spirituality has helped us to how to live a life of peace, life of love, life of harmony. So both have contribution towards human life to make our life better. To me, coming from a country, we believe that is the country with the oldest living culture or civilization. From India, to me there is no conflict between science and spirituality. Rather, there is welcoming and all-embracing love. Science exploring more and more. When I was listening to the previous session, when the honorable speaker was talking of heredity, genetics, environment, I was remembering my teacher who was telling human evolution is based on heredity, environment and culture. Heredity, according to the scientist, is genetics or epigenetics, whatever they say. To my teacher, heredity is divinity, love that we all have inherited. Environment, to the scientists, let it be. In the tissue culture, they put the cell in special solution to observe how the cell is growing. Environment where we live, our society, our culture, or humanity at large. This is the environment where we live. And this environment is nothing but God's love. The plant is giving flower out of love. The mother is looking at the baby out of love. This is all environment, the environment of love. Now it is the culture in which way I will look at it. So, we heard about evolution. This universe is evolving. We hear of evolution, the scientific thought and ideas evolving. God is evolutionary. We the human beings sometimes we behave like revolutionary. We speak against each other. Instead of speaking against each other, let us bridge the gap to bring more love, unity, harmony, which is potential in each one of us. Science can be complement to spirituality, spirituality can be complement to science, just like two hands. So, if the topic is new sciences meeting old wisdom, the oldest wisdom is love. The creation started out of love. And the creation is evolving out of love. Whether a scientist is doing experiment in the laboratory, or a mother is taking care of the baby, or a teacher is teaching about spirituality, it is all out of love. There is no creation out of love, and there is no existence out of love. And where there is love, there is no distance, there is no differences, there is no conflict. And in love, or in the loving atmosphere, let it be humanity or the creation on this earth, or individually in our own life, there will be more peace, harmony and love. So, to me, science is keeping the eyes open. As we heard the optical illusion and how to see and we perceive with our own notion or our own creativity with the vision, the spiritualist many times they say, close your eyes. So scientists exploring same truth outside to find what is reality. A spiritual person with eyes closed or eyes half open, finding the same reality, what is the truth behind? And truth is one, truth is not two. Truth is one, and we can speak in many different languages. The scientists could talk in the term of genes or DNA, or in the form of neurons. A spiritual person will speak in the form of another language depending upon one's own spiritual tradition. But the essence is one, to discover truth. The truth is within us. We should explore it, whether we go with eyes open or eyes closed, go eastward or westward, we all are meeting with love. Thank you all. I welcome you. I give my love from the core of my heart. Again, I bow to you and bow to God.
Viva la música, viva, viva la música, viva la música. Those of you who don't know it yet, sing. Viva la música, viva, viva la música, viva la música. Excellent.
To yourself, because you're expecting yourself to live outside your values. On eggshells towards others, instead of caring, where you're seeing that everybody's a reflection of you and they're just as valuable as you and you're communicating in their values because you care. And if that's in an intimate relationship, that caring is what keeps the ring on the finger.
Evolutionary creativity. And so we thought we'd start with that, because this is something where we seem to have some agreement. And then we might move on to topics like consciousness, telepathy, where we probably have more different views. So you actually, this is one of your themes. Why don't you start on evolutionary creativity?
Well, I'm not an evolutionary biologist. I spent half of my scientific life with exploring the effect of environmental influences of experience on the development of brains. And I did this in animals, and then later on a little bit in human subjects. And then the second period of my life I spent in analyzing coordination processes that bind together the distributed activities in the brain towards coherent conscious states, for example. But of course we all have to deal with evolution to some extent or the other, because the systems we are working in are the product of evolution. And we were actually discussing whether or not the next Waldzell meeting should, at least in part, focus on the following issue. We see that evolution has been successful in bringing forth systems of increasing complexity, and that seems to be a common trend of evolutionary creativity, to make systems more and more complex. Now, through miraculous mechanisms that we haven't fully understood yet, evolution has found a way to couple the elements that make complex systems. Now you can take whatever you want, a single cell with all its little proteins and signaling cascades inside, or you can take ensembles of cells that form an organ, or you can take organs that form an organism, or you can take the brain, which is made out of 10 to the 11th neurons, which are all coupled to each other. And these systems are robust and stable. And this is a miracle, because intuitively you would think the more complex you make a system, the more fragile it becomes. And what we ignore to date is we have some ideas and we have some evidence also why these highly complex systems can be so stable. And the trick seems to be to find an architecture of interactions that has certain properties which allows those systems to self-organize and to self-stabilize, and to do this against robust disturbances, because if you think what an organism experiences throughout life is being disturbed all the time, and it always finds back to its homeostasis. And what we were thinking of doing, maybe part of the next Waldzell meeting, if ever I get invited again, is to look into several of the scientific disciplines that deal with complex systems. It's brain research, then it's the research on the immune system, which is also a very distributed system, which is extremely stable and intelligent, as complex nearly as the brain, and see whether the principles that nature has invented in order to keep those systems stable cannot be transposed into other complex systems that worry us so much, like economical systems, social systems, and political systems, because they have exactly the same problem. A lot of players connected and trying to create robustness and stability, error tolerance. And it is my gut feeling, but not only mine, that the way we do it, creating hierarchical structures, control systems that organize these complex systems like a conductor organizes the orchestra, that this is not an appropriate strategy if systems get beyond a certain degree of complexity. Now, the question, why has evolution produced so complex systems? Why has it been striving for complexity? Could have done away with simple systems. Why making them more and more complex? And I think, even though there is no teleological principle behind evolution, at least not in my mind, what happened is that life developed, and it essentially developed in the moment where there was a cell membrane, because then you had an autonomous agent. There was a trend for fitness, which makes that the fitter you get, no, you should say the other way around, the more you become independent of the disturbances of your environment, the fitter you are. Now, how do you get fit? By being able to maintain your homeostasis, your characteristic shape or dynamics, irrespective of disturbances. And interestingly enough, it turns out that the most efficient strategy to achieve this is increase your complexity. In the first spaceships that were going to the moon, people thought that, and also in early airplane constructions, that the only way to make an airplane error tolerant and robust against disturbances was to introduce redundancy, to triple or quadruple the same function. Instead of one computer, you put four, but one hydraulic systems, you put four. They all work according to the same principle. If one drops out, you take the second. Now, it turned out that this is not the best way. The best way is to distribute the functions into networks. Modern airplanes are packed with hundreds and hundreds of computers, microprocessors that are interconnected in a highly complex way. Intuitively, you would think, this is the way to catastrophe, because these systems are so fragile, and if you can't understand them anymore. They have their own dynamics, and don't do that. It turns out that this is the way towards robustness, because if the architecture of interaction is done right, you can take out bits and pieces. It may slow down a little bit, it may be a little bit less efficient, but it does not break down. And this is the way organisms are made And this is the way we would our complex systems, like economy and so on, we would like them to be like that, so that they don't go into these catastrophic bounces. And so apparently evolution has found this trick: increase complexity to become more autonomous, increase the number of senses that you have, become more independent of the environment, and be able to very elastically respond to disturbances. And that's probably why we became so horribly complex. And we are certainly assumed as the most autonomous beings of all, which causes us also a lot of trouble because we get more and more able to shape our environment, and we make errors there. Maybe this is the end of it. Huh? Anyway, that's how I see it. No, let me add another thing that shows how great evolution proceeded. It is now known, and it's a very recent discovery. It has to do with the epigenetics that also Bruce Lipton described. You remember when Venter, the human genome is now known, is the genome of mice and rats, and they're all fully described. But what is fully described is only the coding sequences, those which make proteins, a product. And we know that this is only about 1% of the DNA in our chromosomes. The rest has been considered junk. Now it turns out it's not junk. Every coding region has, and this has been known for some time, another sequence in front of it which is modulated and determines how much of this coding sequence is expressed and translated into proteins. So this is regulatory genes that sit in front of it. It's already known that there are many, many substances and environmental influences acting on these, we call them promoters, that regulate how much is expressed. Now it turns out that this is not yet the junk, this is still known coding stuff. But in between there is what has been thought to be nothing, just not producing anything. It turns out that this is not junk, but it is sequences that have more or less the property of viruses. Viruses are also just DNA packages that have a number of possibilities to smuggle themselves into the genome in order to reproduce themselves. So they are triplet parasites. It turns out that evolution has endowed the genome with this, no longer be addressable as junk sequences, the only function of which is to create diversity. These regions in between, acting like viruses, they can, for example, cut themselves out, disconnecting from here, disconnecting from there, and then migrate along the DNA sequence until they find again a place where they fit. And then they insert themselves and maybe double themselves and change the genome. They usually do this on these modulatory sites so that they can modulate, up and down regulate the coding genes. And apparently the junk is full of these little ghosts whose only purpose is to create variability. So this is, of course, very, very adapted in terms of evolutionary processes. Evolution didn't wait, creating a very robust genome, for variability to occur because cosmic rays were producing mutations, knocking out amino acid DNA molecules. Didn't wait for people to smoke in order to break up these sequences, but it built in mechanisms that actively create variability. And this is the way towards complexity. You create variability, and then you select. If it works, fine. If it doesn't work, you die out. And this is how it actively promoted its own evolution, which is a great trick. And you probably can learn a lot of it. But I think here we agree.
Yes. I mean, this is what you've just summarized so well about complexity, order, robustness. We totally agree on. And that's the same starting point that I come from. And I started as a developmental biologist working on the development of plants. I spent 15 years working on plants and how they grow. And one of the things that the big problem in developmental biology is not only are you dealing with a complex system with interacting parts, you start with a much simpler system, the fertilized egg, which then develops into a plant or into an organism like you or me, with lots of different organs, all coordinated.
Which is fantastic.
Which is fantastic. So how does it happen? And this is the big challenge of developmental biology. The focus of molecular biology has been on how genes are switched on and off. This only answers part of the problem because it tells you which proteins are made and which are not made. But there's a difference between making proteins and forming a cell or an organ or a tissue. The whole formative process is not simply explained by having the right proteins. That is called self-assembly. They somehow self-assemble. So what does self-assembly mean, and how does it work, and how is it organized? That's the starting problem for me. And I started off working on plants. People said, well, hormones are what coordinate it all. Auxin is one of the main hormones. I worked out how it was made in the plant, and I helped work out the mechanism of transport. There's a polar transport system. And I thought at first, this is really exciting, we're going to understand plants. Then I realized, actually it explains too much. The same hormone is in all plants. So to understand the difference between a cabbage and a beech and a palm tree, auxin itself cannot explain this.
They have different genes.
They have different genes, certainly. It means that it switch on different proteins. But then when I came to look at the literature on developmental biology, since the 1920s, developmental biologists, most of them who've really seriously worked on the subject, are convinced that there's some kind of integrative, robust, holistic system where the interactions not only happen together but have a robustness. To explain that, the concept was introduced in the 1920s of morphogenetic fields, form-shaping fields. Of course, the question is, what are they? That's the next part of the story. But the reason that the concept of fields was introduced is that fields are the one thing that we have in nature which are intrinsically homogeneous. If you take a magnet and you cut a magnet into little bits, each little bit is a complete magnet. The field, you can't have a part of a field, they're always wholes. The gravitational field, the magnetic field, all these fields are wholes. If you take a willow tree and you cut it into little bits, each cutting can give rise to a complete new tree. So each has the potential to regenerate the whole. And the analogy...
Which is not the case in all organisms.
No, not in all organisms. If you cut an embryo in
pieces after 2 months of maturation,
then there's a limit to regeneration. But lower animals, a planaria, a flatworm, you can cut into small pieces, each can grow a new worm. You can cut the leg off a newt, and the newt will grow a new leg. You can even cut the lens out of the eye of a newt, and it will grow a new lens from the edge of the iris. Which is
but it's not much different from healing. I mean, I cut here, and my epithelium knows where to grow, how long to grow.
Yes, it's more complex. Wound healing is an example of regeneration on a smaller scale.
Yeah, fairly complex.
Yes. But anyway, the idea of morphogenetic fields was that organisms are shaped by these fields, which just like a magnetic field has a shape, a structure, and shapes are unfounding, so fields within organisms.
This was 1920.
Yes, and the idea has been developing in developmental biology ever since. This is still a mainstream, really important concept in developmental biology. And not just my interpretation of it, I mean, I interpret it in my own way, but if you read the latest books on EVO, evolutionary developmental biology, Sean Carroll's book, for example, the morphogenetic field concept is staging a big comeback at the moment in evolutionary developmental biology because development seems to be modular. There's now a whole class of genes, homeobox genes, which switch on or off whole paths of development. For example, in fruit fly, you can have a gene that causes the halter, the balancing organ, to turn into an extra wing. And so it's like switching a channel on a TV set. These genes switch on or switch off whole pathways of development. When they were first discovered in the 1980s, people thought, here it is, the key to development. Then they found that the homeobox genes in fruit flies, in mice and in human beings are virtually identical.
Well, that doesn't matter because they work on a completely different orchestra.
Yes, the interesting thing is the orchestra they work on. At first people thought these were the key to development. Now they discover they're just switches that are the same in all organisms. And what you call the different orchestra they work on is what in developmental biology is called the morphogenetic field. Now, you may not like the term, but I'm just telling you as a fact that this is a widely used term within developmental biology. And the reason it's used is, first of all, it gives the idea of a holistic pattern of integration, a robustness to disturbance, an interrelation of parts. Parts are interrelated through fields.
But what are the fields? I mean, what is the interaction mode of these fields? The interactions we talk about are cell-cell contact interactions in receptors. They are diffusible gradients of diffusible growth.
That's one theory of fields, one theory.
So the diffusible factors, of course, they form a field.
Can I ask you to speak? It's absolutely fascinating. I was here at the previous session. The acoustics are appalling in this room. It's a very high ceiling.
The fields, you see, is a big debate within developmental biology. Some biologists say, we don't want mystical concepts, they're just nothing but chemicals. That's the prevalent view has been, they're just chemicals. Others use more neutral terminology. Professor Lewis Wolpert, for example, talks of positional information within a developing organism given by the field. A field gives positional information. It tells you where something is in relation to something else.
Yeah, but why do we have to postulate something that, you see, I was in developmental neurobiology, and the major problem in this field is how do the processes of nerve cells that originate from point A, like in the retina, find their targets in the center, in the brain. And actually, you could call these fields, but it's now known what nature does. It's very clever. Nature read the book of triangulation. It produces a gradient of molecules across the retina of the developing embryo. High gradient of a particular molecule has names on the temporal part, low gradient on the nasal part, right? And then it does the same in the orthogonal axis with another molecule. High gradient, high concentration here, low concentration here. So what you now have is a gradient in two orthogonal coordinates. And from any point on the retina, if you know the ratio of molecule A versus molecule B, you know exactly where you are. It's like triangulation in orientation and landscapes. Now, the same molecules are back in the target structures with exactly the same gradients made through genetic neighborhood relation expression with control. Simple stuff. Now the fibers come in and they bring their gradient with them because they come from a particular place. And they sniff around with surface receptors until they find exactly the same ratio, and then they make a contact. And this is enough to create the first global order. And then comes again another morphogenetic field. This is not precise enough because these molecules' concentrations cannot be sensed so well. Then the embryo is still a little bit more mature, and what then has been discovered is the cells in the retina, they all coupled to each other. And there are electric excitability waves traveling over them in random directions, this way, this way, this way, every second or so. It's already in utero, very early on. So these waves lead to waves of activity in the terminals that come from these cells in the target structure, right? And so you can tell from this temporal correlation between those activations whether these guys are neighbors here or not. If those which are best correlated in time must be the closest neighbors here, because it's a continuous wave. And then there's a mechanism that stabilizes in the targets those which have the highest correlation and throws the others away. And this gives you defining precision. So there is a mechanism that does marvelous things.
Yes, I'm not denying there are chemical mechanisms. I mean, I spent years of my life finding out about it.
So you say
we agree, there are chemical mechanisms. But the retina, for example, is part of the eye, and the eye has a global pattern. You know, it has the back of the eye, it has the lens, it has the iris. And the ability of the eye to regenerate, like in a newt, if you cut out the lens, it can form a new lens from the edge of the iris, when normally it's not formed from the edge of the iris at all. There's some kind of pattern, a holistic pattern involved, a robust holistic pattern. Now, I'm saying that I want to consider the possibility it's a field. And I don't want to jump to the conclusion without further discussion, it must be existing known chemicals or nothing but chemical gradients. I'm saying they play a part, but maybe there's more to it. That's my exploration. And for me, the question when I was thinking about morphogenetic fields was that for me the question is how are they inherited and how do they evolve? Because they're passed on from generation to generation, these formative patterns. So one possibility is that it's all somehow miraculously coded in the genes, so all you do is make the right proteins and the whole thing will just assemble itself. That's the conventional view. For me, it's not credible. I don't believe that. I think it's possible, but always the details get lost. People say, oh, it's much too complicated. In the 1970s, when I first worked on these problems, they said, give us 10 years, we'll work it all out. No need, no problem. I went to a seminar by Sidney Brenner and Francis Crick when I was an undergraduate, and they said, you know, we've solved the genetic code. The two outstanding problems of biology are developmental biology and consciousness. And they said the only reason they've not been solved is because the people working on them aren't clever enough. They said, we're going to solve them. Crick said, I'm taking consciousness. Brenner said, I'm taking development. And they said, we'll have them figured out in 10 years. That was in 1963. Yeah. Now, the thing is that the history of these subjects is one not the triumph that was always anticipated is always in the future. So it's based on issuing sort of promissory notes against future explanations. It's an act of faith that this will be. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm saying that's fine. But I think that in science we need to explore alternatives as well, rather than wait another 50 years for this not to work, to look at alternative ways. And my way of doing it is this, that I think the fields are real, that they're a new kind of field that science hasn't yet recognized, and that they evolved because they've got a kind of memory within them, given by the process I call morphic resonance. Given those postulates, I then try and explore the consequences and how they can be tested. And they may be wrong, but this is a testable theory, and it leads to a range of predictions. And within the realm of developmental biology, it's hard to disentangle possible field effects from unknown chemical effects or electrical effects or possible electrical oscillations or gradients of viscosity or a range of other possible physical causes. But when the field concept is applied to social groups like flocks of birds or schools of fish or termite colonies or packs of wolves, how are the social animals coordinated? Then I think there also is a kind of field that links the parts. We know, of course, that there's a lot of communication through vision, through pheromones, through chemical and other senses. But what I was exploring is the possibility that in a social group, the field is over and above these chemical senses as something that links the parts together, a little bit like a quantum field entangling the different parts within it. Now, one of the consequences of this theory is that if members of the group move apart beyond the range of the normal senses, they may still be in connection, and a change in one might affect the other. Here, then, is a system where you can actually disentangle conventional physics and chemistry from other possible effects. That's why, among other things, I got interested in the possibility of telepathy, because this would predict a kind of communication at a distance between members of groups. So I then started working on this as one of the ways in which this hypothesis could be tested. And because I think animal groups work that way, I looked for telepathy in animals first, not people. And I found there'd been no research on this subject, none. You can read the entire world literature in a couple of hours. It had been completely ignored. And so I started by asking people who have dogs and cats if they'd ever noticed things that seemed telepathic with their animals. And I was inundated with reports. I built up a natural history of these reports, all the different things people claimed. One of the things they claimed was that many dogs and cats seem to know when their owners are coming home and going away to the door. So then I thought, okay, is it just, of course, my first thought is, could it be routine? Could it be subtle cues from the people at home? Could it be the car sounds? These are the first thoughts, 5 minutes to think of those. I discussed it with my friend Nicholas Humphrey, who's a skeptic and a psychologist. And to my surprise, he didn't deny the phenomenon. He said, oh, my dog used to do that. My mother always knew when I was coming home. So I said, well, how do you explain it? I said, it couldn't have heard your car from 20 miles away the other side of Cambridge. And your mother didn't know when you were coming. So he said, oh, on the contrary, it just shows what sharp hearing dogs have got. So I said, okay, I don't think it's hearing. And we thought of an experiment. The way we try and resolve our differences is by thinking of experiments. I said, okay, you come home by train, you borrow a bicycle, there's no familiar sounds. Would the dog know when you were coming home in advance? He said, no. And I said, well, maybe it would. So here's the test, essentially. And I've done lots of these tests with dogs. Filming the place the dog waits, have people go at least 8 kilometers away. They come home at random times, communicated by a pager. The people at home don't know when they're coming. And over again, these dogs go and wait at the door, blind evaluation of the time-coded videotapes. So it looks as if the dogs are responding to their intentions to come home in a telepathic manner.
So where is the bug? Because if this can really be shown that way, I mean, we all, I guess, sitting here, we have experiences in our personal life where we say, damn it, how can this be possible? Let me give you my own experience.
Yes.
Just to tell you that I'm not closed up against anything. I was still in Munich. My children, pair of twins, were 9-year-old or 8-year-old. They were at a carnival party in the midst of winter, because it's always in winter. And they were 1 hour south of where my institute is in the town at the party. And I was supposed to get them. And all I had was from my wife the address where I should get them. So I drove there. It was snowing heavily in Munich, and it took me about an hour to go there. And I came to a house which was empty. No lights, nobody. I faintly remembered then, oh God, I think that they have changed. Yeah, that's true. I had the old address. Now, this was this time before cell phones. There was nobody home, so I could not get the information. So I thought, well, I would have to drive home, wait until my girls ring me, 1 hour here, 1 hour back, 1 hour back. I thought this was a nightmare. So I was furious with myself and with those who informed me, which in this case was my wife. And then I did something completely irrational. I continued driving centrifugally outside, further away. And God knows why I did that. It was heavily snowing, it was no fun to drive around in this time. And I crossed right and I crossed left, I stopped at red lights until I finally ended up in a road that had no end. It was stopped. So I had to turn around, snow, and I drove this road back slowly. And there was an apartment house on the left side. And God knows why. I stopped there, pushed my car into the snow, went over to read the bell names. And while I did this, I saw in my peripheral visual field somebody moving. It was one of my daughters coming up from the cellar where the hobby rooms were to pee, to go in the apartment in the 5th floor, so to pee. And she saw me through the glass door and came and said, Papa, great, we are about to finish. So, horrible experience for a scientist like myself. It's a true story. And so I asked her, Natalie, how could I find you? She said, my sister is still downstairs. She said, well, you are our papa, you know where we are. So for her, the problem was solved. Now, since then, I nag. Now, I think there are two considerations one has always to reflect when one thinks about those psi phenomena, which seem to be so resistant to scientific proof. One is the enormous storage capacity of our subconscious mind. We have no idea of how much we store in there. If you think about the fact that every second you take 4 snapshots of the world throughout your life when you are awake, and you all store them, because when you come to Italy, to a place where you haven't been for 40 years, at a marketplace, you will say, this tree is no longer there.
Why is it so difficult sometimes to retrieve?
Well, you cannot at will find everything in this huge storage device, and some things remain there without having access to consciousness, depending on how they were stored. So there is, of course, the faint possibility in my particular case that there was a lunch conversation saying that these guys had moved. And this for certain has occurred, because I suddenly knew, there was something. Then this was a place in town where I thought I had never been, but you know that there are certain things you don't really remember. Or that I had, at some stage, because they had been living about 2 kilometers from there, looked in the town plan and came it through. And we know that we have this eidetic photographic memory sometimes. And in eidetics, this is explicit. In us, it is implicit. We have no conscious access. So I may have had a rough plan of that town part in my head. I may in addition have known from these lunch conversations that they moved into a building that unfortunately has now 5 stores and they are high up and is no longer a garden as it used to be before and stuff like that. All this is possible and I may not have known it consciously. And that under the stress of, God, what am I going to do? My consciousness had no solution to the problem unless this very cumbersome going forward and backward. But my subconsciousness knew some trial and error, and the chances you will get them, knowing what I know, would probably make the problem easier to solve. And then it guided me. Furiously as I was, without being explicit, it couldn't talk to me, but it could just make me do things. And we know so much that what is stored in the subconscious can make you do things, even though you don't know why you do them. And we know this enormous richness of subconscious knowledge. If you take, we had a conference last year on decision making. We have 2 decision-making mechanisms. One is the conscious one, which is good for rational decisions. It can keep 4 or 5 variables at the same time, and then you can do mathematics on them. This is fine for problems that can be solved unambiguously, where the variables are very clear. It's not good for conditions where you have many variables that need to be weighed against each other, each of them being uncertain, and the interaction dynamics between the variables being very complex. If you then try to rely on this reasoning stuff, you can't do it. Yes. Then you have to rely on your subconscious. And one way to facilitate this is to be out of your mind because you are outrageously furious, or you don't have enough time. Like when a traffic situation becomes complicated, you don't start to compute trajectories before you decide what you do it. And with 90% chance you do the right thing. And you do an enormously complex computation in your subconscious. Taking all those variables quickly in and then finding a solution and acting. And it's as if something acted without you. And so maybe some of those things, two things. One is this, and the other is that very often we make the wrong statistical assumptions. Gigerenzer works on that at the last one. Well, that we think that things that appear extremely unlikely, like I dreamt tonight that my dog was going away tomorrow. How many times you dream this, but then there is a coincidence and it actually runs away, you say, I knew it before.
Well, I agree, all this is true, and it may be that your hypothesis will explain what happened, but the point of research in this field is to rule out those explanations.
Right.
That's why in my dog experiments, done over and over again, we try to rule them out. And another field, I'll give one more example. In my surveys of human experience, it turns out by far the commonest kind of telepathic experience in the modern world occurs with telephone calls.
Yeah.
Most people, about 80%, have had the experience of thinking of someone who then rings. Now, I know what you're going to say. We think of people all the time, one rings, then you think it's telepathy and you forget all the time.
Or post hoc interpretations. This is a big problem, like the déjà vu experiences, that sometimes we mix up the sequence of events.
Yes.
He called, and then you think afterwards, oh God, I thought beforehand, but you didn't actually. You make up the story.
Yeah, you're quite right. That could be so. But when I started thinking about telephone telepathy, many of my friends rapidly pointed out to me those kinds of arguments, what I would call armchair arguments. So the aim then is to think of an experiment which can actually find what is the actual chance level and what really happens. So that's why I designed experiments and I've been doing them. And how the experiment works is that if you were the subject, you would give me the names of 4 people you might be telepathic with, your twins, your wife, maybe a good friend, 4 people with their phone numbers. You then sit at home, landline telephone in front of you, video camera with time code pointing at you in a pre-agreed period. We then pick one of the 4 people at random. by a random number generator, ask them to call you, would say, please, we ring them and say, please call Wolf now, or in 5 minutes. You sit there, the phone rings, you know it's part of the experiment, you know it's one of these 4 people. Before you lift up the receiver, you have to say who it is. And then when you pick it up, you say, hello, Mary, or whoever you think it is. So your chance of being right by chance, by mere coincidence, is 25%, 1 in 4. We've done hundreds of these tests, and the actual level is about 45%. The p-value is 1 times 10 to the minus 12. So, you know, there may be some flaw in the experiment, but the fact is that this is an experimental test that has been published in, you know, severely peer-reviewed journals. It's been replicated by me and by others, most recently by some experiments in Freiburg at the university. So here's something that looks like evidence that all the obvious explanations, subconscious reasoning, fallible understanding of statistics, appear to be ruled out. And moreover, it agrees with the common experience of millions of people.
Yeah.
So the thing, you see, for me the problem is, here's an experiment, here's a phenomenon, here's a test obeying normal scientific rules, published in scientific journals, replicated in 3 universities. And the problem for me is, why are people so resistant to this? Why does it arouse in some people dismissal, incredulity, anger? Why isn't this just science?
Yeah, if it can really be done that way. I mean, there are these early experiments that had been performed in Stanford in the physics department, which also looked nice. They were double-blind. The procedure was as follows. There was a medium. One was the police head of San Francisco, so was particularly gifted to find out where people were. I mean, we all have those stories. I mean, there was this Polish guy who could find the cadavers everywhere in the world. So what they did is they took the target person and moved it to 5 or 6 places that had been predetermined, and the medium knew about those. No, the medium didn't know anything. But another group that was selected to evaluate the verbal protocol and the drawings of the medium, who had to indicate where he thought they were, painting bridges or marketplaces or whatever. So the target was transported from here to there, and for a particular period of time had to be there, and the medium at that time, sitting in a Faraday cage to make sure it's not electromagnetic waves, was tracing and protocoling where he thought this guy was. And then they took this other observer group, which was familiar with those 5 places, and their task was to say, well, given what he said and what he traced, it's probably that place rather than that place. Yes. It looks quite good statistics, eh? And it was, of course, also statistically significant. And in one case, I think there was even an error trial inadvertently, where they had also transported the targets with the plane to probe for distance effects. And this guy had missed the plane and hadn't been where he was supposed to be at the right place. And what the medium made was a strip near to water, and they said, man, this is funny, he can't be there. But it then turned out he missed the plane and he was still at the airport in the Caribbean somewhere. This has been published twice in Nature and 2 or 3 times in IEEE, which is really high rating stuff. And then it disappeared completely. Now, you must understand my inquiétude as a brain researcher. If this is really true, we are in very poor shape because we have not the faintest idea of how to explain those things in terms of our interpretations. Then we should move all our institutes to investigating those phenomena carefully. Now, I read all the stuff that Bender did in Freiburg, who was a believer and made experiments, quantitative, and all of them failed because they were statistically not robust. And why do I not read tons of papers in serious journals that prove that this exists? Because I would really move my whole institute and forget about oscillations and synchrony and do only this, because this is where the future is. So what is the reason? Why don't I know your papers? Where are they published?
Well, I submitted, some of them are in perceptual and motor skills, one of them, my one's on email telepathy. The replication at Freiburg was submitted 2 months ago to perception, which is a fairly
well, if it gets there, then...
But what happened was that the editor wrote to the author of it, Stefan Schmidt in Freiburg. He sent me a copy of the letter. He said, any experiment that shows positive results for telepathy must be erroneous. I'm rejecting it without refereeing. Well, Schmidt wrote back to him and said, you know, the cardinals refused to look through Galileo's telescope. Do you want to be like them? And the editor wrote back and said, that's a risk I'm prepared to take. So at least he was honest. But I can't tell you, my work on dogs, I submitted to animal behavior. The editor rejected it by saying any paper that mentions the word telepathy would not be approved by our referees. Therefore, to avoid wasting your time and mine, I'm rejecting it straight away. I can't tell you how many times this happens. There's a level of prejudice, you see, which for some reason, for me, I'm interested in why does these phenomena excite such a high level of prejudice. For example, in America, there's an organization called the Skeptical Association, the Skeptical Inquirer, the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal. It has 60,000 members. The number of full-time parapsychologists in America is 3. So they're outnumbered 20,000 to 1 by well-funded, well-organized skeptics whose aim is to deny these phenomena. Why is it that there's such prejudice? Why? I mean, can you explain this? Why?
Well, I think I know a little bit why.
Why?
I was together with you in Tucson at this second conference on consciousness. There are 2 different camps. And I must admit that 80% of the stuff I heard there was so spooky and so unscientific and so unserious, muddling up quantum physics with brain processes, and everything was okay that supported these crazy ideas. That was my idea. And there were so many non-serious people there that I think the few serious ones were just swallowed. The field is destroying itself by admitting such strong contamination by non-scientific thinking. So if they would put more auto-discipline on themselves and really do it the way it is accepted in the scientific community, there would be less of a problem.
Well, when you say the field, you see it's a very, very small field. I mean, 3 people in America, maybe 5 or 6 in England, no grants from ordinary grant-giving agencies, rejection by leading journals on principle, and nothing but trouble for people who follow this in their career. It seriously damages their career.
This is why I don't dare to go into it, because I would see... First, I have not the robust evidence, I don't have a model to work on, so I can't do it. I know this experiment that runs at MIT, it runs for fun there. They found out that the non-manned spaceships were less in trouble of computer failure than the manned ones. So the idea was, well, maybe the morphogenetic field or whatever field that emanates from human beings disturbs these computers. And so what they did is they set up a whole bench of computers, number generators, random number generators, and said, well, let's see whether the presence or absence of human observers changes the output of these random number generators. And since these guys can produce numbers with extremely high rates, they get large statistics. And yes, there are 1 or 2 papers, 3 papers that say that in the presence of a human being that is sitting there trying to influence those number generators by will to produce more odd numbers than even numbers, there is a slight bias because of these huge numbers that they generate towards what the observer wanted.
Well, I agree, it's not very interesting.
It's tiny effects. Well, if it's an effect, I mean, it's very interesting, because how can I influence a silicon chip?
I think it's better to start... I start from ordinary phenomena, like telephone telepathy, dogs that know when their owners are coming home, that many people claim exist. And so I start from a natural history of what appears to occur on a regular basis for many people. But I think the reason why these are interesting, also the reason why at Tucson there are people mentioning quantum physics and the brain and so on, is that the central problem of consciousness studies is consciousness. And if there was a convincing theory of consciousness in science, there wouldn't be this problem. But there isn't. And now, I mean, I know your own work on correlations in the brain. I mean, if there's correlations of activity in different parts of the brain sometimes result in consciousness, I mean, how would you explain it? I mean, can I ask you your own theory of consciousness? How is it that material changes in the brain give to rise to?
Yeah,
Yes.
we had this discussion just in the session that we had before.
Oh, I'm sorry to repeat it so soon, but it is a central problem.
Yeah, I think in order to... We have two description systems that have evolved completely in parallel. The neurophysiological one that looks at the nitty-gritty details, and there we can find neuron correlates of conscious states or of altered conscious states. So this is fine. Correlation, no causal relation. And then we have all these other description systems that come from observation of the other and from introspection. They have developed completely independently, different words for similar phenomena. And now I think we will not be able to solve that problem at the Sprachspiel level, at the linguistic level, unless we consider the brains as being part of a network of brains of a society of cultural evolution that has found names for all those strange things, like a feeling, like a consciousness, which we get familiar with when we grow up. Little children don't know anything about this, apes never. And then you get told by your caretakers, and you find out yourself, when episodic memory develops, that there is something that deserves a name. And then a feeling that you have gets a name. And then the neurobiologists come around and tell you, well, you know, this thing for which you have a name that you can't really touch, this is correlated with this particular state of nerve cells in your brain, which you can't feel because you have no feeling for what's going on in your brain. And that's how the problem emerges. I think it is not unsolvable, but we aren't there yet. Now, I talked to Zeilinger, who has also been here at one of the meetings, this quantum physicist in Vienna, several times, because we thought, of course, if entanglement things would work in the brain, it would solve some of these questions. He said, forget it, it's too warm, too large, too wet. All the quantum states would collapse. Then we tried to find a way out, and I asked him, is it conceivable that through complexity and nonlinear dynamics, you get a system that at the formal level behaves like a quantum system, but doesn't use the quantum dynamics, but it simulates similar phenomena. Yes, there is a little bit of it possible. The anomalous wave propagation you have in nonlinear systems could be of interest here, and then the synchronization of remote oscillators through a third party which has some miraculous phenomena, properties. All this could be. In the moment we don't know. But why don't we conceive of something that will make the critical experiment and convince the scientific community? I mean, if it's there, this is how quantum physics made its way. Some people discovered that the black body radiation doesn't fit the classical theory. There were mistakes behind the comma. In front of the comma, everything seemed fine. So for classical physics, it was no problem. But if you look more in detail, then it doesn't work anymore. And this is what triggered the beginning of quantum physics. So if this is so robust, and if one can free it from contamination, because I get, of course, tons of letters of people who have their consciousness in the knee and who can feel water flowing somewhere because they have special senses here, and they say that elephants have it in the feet. And, you know, there is so much mystics that it is so polluted that you have a very hard time to get rid of that.
Yes, but nevertheless the problem remains. And since you work on perception, I mean, how do you think, when I see this room, it's not just a question of qualia. I'm experiencing three-dimensional space outside my head. Now, it's not just a different way of talking about nerve impulses. All the nerve impulses are inside my head. The visual impressions I'm getting from this room and the windows and the views through the windows are outside my head. Now, is that just an illusion, or are they really there? And what form does this three-dimensional experience of space take? Is it if it's all in the brain, how come it's not just a matter of words, we experience it as being out there?
Yeah. Well, I think with respect to this, we have a bunch of mechanisms that can explain this very well. As long as you have both eyes open, you can use step cues through disparity. That works for up to 5 meters or so. If you close your eye, you lose this effect. Actually, you should do this when you go through a gallery of op art. It's fascinating. Many of these tricks there, they play on binocular vision. If you close one eye, it loses all its charm. And the trompe-l'œil painters, of course, also used monocular cues, and this is why they go far away. So he has no chance to find out this parallax movement or so, whether it's 3 or 2 dimensions. But I think we understand very well, and Hoffman has shown us beautiful demonstrations of shape from shading, and how the visual system computes from the cues it gets 3 dimensions out of 2-dimensional representation, because what you have on the retina is a 2-dimensional brightness distribution, nothing more. Evolution, experience, I think this is all not a problem. A problem is really if you sit down on the boat and I have no idea you are there, and I sort of get the strange feeling Sheldrake is in this. This is the problem.
It was designed by Walter Goodman to leading American artists who specialized on library projects around the world. And now I would like to welcome by